Welcome back, Sabeeha and Walter. How are you?
Doing great.
Thank you.
Cool. You guys are in great harmony because when I ask the questions, you answer like exactly. So there's a lesson right there in how to make it happen. First of all, thanks for an absolutely wonderful part one of this conversation. Related to the great book and the great title, "We Refuse to Be Enemies." And I know, Sabeeha, you've got it there. Do you want to show it? Because I haven't. There you go. I'm proud to say I did finish, and it was a great read, an easy read, wonderful.
I had it too.
Double whammy. Well, if I stand up, mine's just over there, but I'm not. So, no, I first of all, thank you for rating it. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and there's so much I learned, and so much that sometimes you need a reminding of too, that of what's important out there. So let's follow up now with some questions, and hopefully within those questions you can share more related stories from your lives, from the book. We'll just we'll be spontaneous. Why not spontaneous? So I'd love to start with. I got some notes. I don't forget this. I'd like to start with you a lot of times reference. One influencer I had way back, I've told you, told me brilliance is simple, and you reference something all the time, but bringing people together, and how, Muslims, Jews, meeting for the first time, bring them together, welcoming, being open to them, and embracing. And I love when you put capital O for others in the book also. That's so respectful, such a small thing, but big time, I think, that I loved. So two super quick stories on my part of experiences, super quick because they could be long. So years ago, I met this fellow who was an Egyptian, started an Arab-Israeli group to come together. He wrote a letter to Golda Meir, and he communicated with him. Fast forward, they became friends that way, and he started another group in Lebanon. Then he came to Montreal, where I met him, bringing Arabs and Jews together. And he was the first Egyptian or Arab born outside of Israel that was admitted to Hebrew University by Golda Meir. And I'm talking like 70s back then. And unfortunately, I lost contact with him, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And I keep trying to find where he is. But that was one story that hit me big time about people, in this case, a prime minister. And in the other case, with all respect, a regular person. That said, I thought all Jews were animals until I read your book, and she responded to him. That was one thing that was an experience that I had that really hit home. And there's others, but your comments and stories on how you've seen trust and understanding happen or not. Could you share a little bit about what you saw and how that happened?
Well, sure. So, I've over the years there's so many encounters, one-to-one encounters that I've been involved with, where you see a relationship grow and blossom. So when you asked this question, I was, perplexed who to take. But there's two that I sort of put together because they're with two gentlemen, one from New Jersey and one from Northern Virginia, who both have the same last name, Chaudhry, which is a very Pakistani name. So I was already involved with Pakistanis even before I met Sabeeha.
She wasn't the first?
She was not the first, certainly the closest at this point. But both of them, it was just interesting when you say, so I call it the tale of two Chaudhrys, if you will, although they spell their names different. One has an H in it and one doesn't, or Caudhry is one, and the other one is without the second H. So you got to be careful with that. But the first one, the guy without the H, Ali Chaudhry, he's based in northern New Jersey, and I remember meeting him and having gone to a Muslim event about an hour from his home, and we drove back, and we had such an illuminating conversation. That was our first time I think we really bonded, where I was talking to him about how I'd had the impression always that Islam had been spread by the sword, kind of erupting out of Arabia and sort of conquering half the world in, a few decades. And he said, well, Walter, think about it. How could that have happened? if it was just with the sword. The Arabs, who had been really nothing until that point, erupted out, and they conquered the Persian Empire, and they conquered most of the Byzantine Empire, and they spread. So there must have been something going on besides the sword, and he said, well, you know what, it was this equality that they kind of human equality that they were offering, that everyone was the same, equal under the eyes of God, which going to many of these societies had not been the case. And that was certainly the case when they came to India and they found the class system and obviously spread Islam in India. So that's just one example. But we had this wonderful conversation, the two of us, and then I don't know exactly the sequence, but I got involved where his mosque, or a community, I should say, it was a mosque, but they didn't really have their own building, and they were forced to rent it. And then when they wanted to build a beautiful mosque right in the center of Basking Ridge, New Jersey, they ran into all kinds of opposition from zoning boards. And I came out to testify on their behalf. And it was a kind of a frustrating experience because they were being told that this is just about, well, there's going to be a lot of runoff from, the parking lot, and, you don't have enough parking, and, but somehow it hadn't been the case about with the church that had been built recently, or the synagogue. So I just testified, you really can't, do that, even though they weren't really admitting they were doing it. But I came there as a Jew, and I said, I know these people, these are really, really wonderful people. We've done so much great work in Muslim-Jewish relations. So I think it had something of an impact. And then after that, Ali took that same concept and he extended it further. He came up with the idea. We have this precept that Sabeeha and I talked about, standing up for the other. And he actually created a pledge about standing up, that if you're among your own group and you hear some aspersions toward another group, that I pledge to stand up and say, that's not okay. I'm standing up for the other. And he actually got this passed unanimously in the New Jersey State Senate and legislature. So a wonderful relationship that we built that continues to this day. And the other Chaudhry is Dr. Maksud Chaudhry in Northern Virginia, who is a dentist, and he hosted a wonderful event, a health fair that we did for newly arrived Syrian refugees about 5 or 6 years ago. But he was very into the Muslim Jewish thing, but he was always saying, we need to do something for the Palestinians. It can't just be about what we're doing here. And then I was able to talk to him about Project Rosanna, which I talked about here, this wonderful program to get these Palestinian children to hospitals in Israel and save their lives. So he joined the board of Project Rosanna. He was the first Muslim to do that. And it took a lot of courage, actually. So again, it was this process of building this relationship step by step. And so both of these Chaudhrys have been really emblematic, I think, of my getting closer to so many people in the Muslim community step by step, and sometimes, setbacks, sometimes misunderstandings, but growing closer and closer.
No, that's great. Overcoming setbacks actually creates a lot of trust and understanding too. What about you, Sabeeha?
Yeah, and that trust eventually leads to bonding, as in my case with sisters. So we were at a meeting of the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, the New York chapter, and the agenda for that meeting was that each of us will bring an object that means something to us. And the whole idea was, let's get to know one another beyond our faith. One of the Turkish women held up a bracelet and said, "This was made for me by my father when he was in prison." And we all went like this. She started telling her story that her father had been imprisoned in Turkey because of his political views. He wanted to keep his daughter safe, so he asked her to go to the United States and make a career for herself over there as a doctor. She was a practicing physician in Turkey. So she came, and now her passport was expiring, and she was afraid that she would be deported by the Turkish embassy. And she was afraid to go back. Well, in that instant, all these women particularly the Jewish women, they whipped out their phones and they said, call Hayes, here's the phone number. I have the name of a lawyer who will do pro bono work for you. Here's another contact person. Speak to him, call him, contact him, email him. I'll call for, on your behalf. And within a few minutes, the whole agenda had shifted. We had a plan. We had a plan. And then within a week, the court had issued her a 5-year extension to stay in the United States, after which she could apply for asylum. And then we did some crowdfunding against her protests. And now she is well on her way to establishing herself here as a doctor. And this was just one example of how we transitioned from understanding each other's faith to developing trust and eventually bonding as sisters.
No, that's beautiful. It's a little off the topic, but not. I saw a movie recently called, and I thought of you guys, Between Enemies on Netflix. And without giving away the story, the head of the Ku Klux Klan in this region became close and friends with the Black woman that was all everything going on. And that true story, and they've gone around the country, talking about it. So it can happen even in that type of thing. A lot of the discussion, we've had and you have in the book is relevant to, Muslim and Jews here in the US, as well as in the Middle East. And as you say in the book, for different reasons, it's important to achieve the former, what's happening here in the US, and not let that go astray because you can't solve the other one. Can you talk a little bit about that? It sounds so simple, but it relates to your putting the Palestinian-Israeli thing on the side a little bit without putting it away, so that you can achieve something big here. And there's other reasons to achieve something big here too. So maybe go back to Sabeeha, you first this time.
Well, I think I'll defer to Walter.
Okay, you can defer.
On that. Yeah,
That's nice. Thanks, Sabeeha. Yeah, I think in terms of the work that I was doing, even very early on in the Muslim Jewish work back in 2007, 8, 9, we were very, felt very strongly that it was so important not to allow the kind of hatred, fear, and loathing that unfortunately existed and exists in between Israelis and Palestinians to infect us over here. And certainly it had. Certainly it had, to the extent that the Muslim and Jewish communities had very little contact. Thank God there was very little, violence, but that wasn't out of the question, and there have been a few tragic incidents. And so so first of all, let's prevent that from coming here. Let's build these ties of friendship, communication, and cooperation, friendship and trust here. And based on and there's a common interest between both communities to make that happen. I think that's very, very important. So it's not, as we often say, it's not just kumbaya, because that's sometimes you hear that. Oh yeah, very nice, but it's much more than that. It wouldn't have worked if it hadn't been about that, the interest of both communities to prevent a kind of really serious alienation that could, God forbid, end in violence. And then to build the ties that we have built, which we're just early on, but have made a huge difference. I really do believe in, especially during this last 4 years, and that to have these two communities standing together was it was a very important statement, and really, really mattered, and gave hope. And ultimately, what it's about, Mark, is that we want to set an example that there is hope, that Muslims and Jews can come together. That's sort of that's sort of counterintuitive, and say, wow, if that's possible, then why not these groups, and why not maybe we can heal American society, and Democrats and Republicans and all that, and ultimately also Israel Palestine. That the thing that's so awful, and I think you may have said this the last time, is that lack of hope at this point. There was strong hope in the 90s that this was going to be over, and we'd find a way, and then it all went to hell in a handbasket, and it's so tragic. But when you think of those young, those next generation growing up, and the generation after that, with this sense of this is going to be going on forever, that's what we have to break. and there really isn't any reason ultimately why good human beings on both sides can't reach out across those barricades and make a difference. So that's what we're trying to do and say.
And talk about an era that needs it right now, including here in the U.S. more than ever. And I've read a few studies on what we call the human element, and it's been super clear that after food and air, belonging is the thing that fills people's hearts and souls more than anything out there. Whether it's belonging in your family, belonging in your community, belonging in the company you're in, people want to feel that they belong and they have a purpose. And to both your points, the emotional connection is critical. And of course, that could be an example to Ku Klux Klan and a Black woman and all that when they get to know each other. So I think it's brilliant. Sabeeha, did you want to comment on that, or I have another question I wanted to ask you?
Let's take your other question.
Okay, this is like Jeopardy or something, I think. So we kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think it's really important, especially your involvement with women, Sabeeha. And it's often said that it's going to be up to moms and mothers, to create peace, just because of, not to stereotype, the nurturing and look at both of your moms, what great things they did. So there's an example too. A program that we are starting now to recommend to a lot of clients, I may have told you about, is called Nonflict. And they've done the workshops with Palestinian mothers and wives and Israelis mothers and wives. And at some point you'll hear the story where they challenged the founder of Nonflict to say, if you can bring the head of Palestine, the head of Israel, our husbands and everybody together, we won't let them out of the room until they get this right, that type of thing. So can you talk a little bit about moms and wives and mothers, and has there been any impact there, or what's up with that?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And as you said, it is the nurturing element there, and also, the ability to build consensus is much more powerful amongst mothers, my experience. I was at a conference of the sisterhood where we agreed that our slogan will be, "We shall wage peace," and that became a national movement. That became the slogan of the sisterhood, that we mothers and sisters will wage peace. And it reminded me of a movie called Pray the Devil Back to Hell, where the setting is Liberia, and there was this civil war between the Muslims and the Christians that had been raging forever. There was no hope for peace. Eventually, the women got together, the Christian women and the Muslim women, and they had a plan. They took to the streets and they put their husbands on notice that we will stay out on the streets in protest, and we refuse to sleep with you unless you make peace.
That's the worst thing you can do to a guy.
So they came to the table. It worked. But peace was still not happening. So eventually then they took step number 2. They locked the doors of the conference room and they gave them a deadline that by this time, you will come up with a peace plan. Otherwise, we women are going to go out into the public square and strip. And in that culture,
that's the second worst thing.
That was a big deal. Big deal. So guess what? They made peace. And one of those women was then elected as the head of state of Liberia.
That's right.
So yeah, definitely we have seen the ripple effects of these organizations like the Sisterhood, like the Muslim Jewish Solidarity Committee in New York City, of which I am a member, that how we can, at the grassroots level, one-on-one, one person at a time, as mothers, carrying their little babies, nursing them at these meetings, one person at a time can make a difference, for sure.
Yeah, it just seems like men have been made for some reason. You can't stereotype because that doesn't make any sense, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Men seem to have the need to fight, for lack of a better word, for stuff, and women say we don't need to fight, we can figure this out, type of deal. And it's real. I think it's real. So you both refer to times when you disagreed and or challenged, for example, Sabeeha on the Muslim side and Walter on the Jewish side, rabbis or imams or politicians, or even Walter, the terrorist that you talked about in Oslo. You were challenging and going to scenarios where, and then you turned it around, kind of not in favor of him, but understanding his position. Have you found, best way I can put this, have you found such honesty to create more credibility and make a difference? I'll go to Walter first on that.
Well, Mark, I'm not a what's the word, a naturally confrontational person at all. And that's been always hard for me, in journalism sometimes to really stand my ground. But there's moments where I have that I'm very proud of. One I'll share very quickly was when I was interviewing Ariel Sharon. I'm sure you remember him, who was called the bulldozer. I mean, he was a force of nature. And I was interviewing him as a journalist not long, about a year after the Sabra and Shatila massacre. And I was asking him tough questions, and he got very belligerent, jumped up and said, "I'm walking out, this interview is over," and, tried to browbeat me. And I did somehow manage to stand my ground at that point. Eventually he sat down, we finished the interview, and he shared a lot of stuff, and it was, came out very, very well. And that's what I've often found with those kind of things. Jumping to the other side for a minute. Well, let me share another one. But sometimes there's this other thing where there was another Jewish leader, American Jewish leader named Rabbi Alexander Schindler, who I literally loved as a human being. He had been very kind to me as a journalist for more than a decade. I'd say about 15 years when I was a Jewish journalist in New York. And then there came a moment where, when Netanyahu was elected the first time in 1996, I wrote an op-ed which ran in the Los Angeles Times, and I said, we can't, American Jewish leaders today can't make the same mistake that Rabbi Schindler made back in 1977 when he was the top American Jewish leader, and the Likud came to power for the first time, and they said, we're going to settle the West Bank. They started calling it, it was Menachem Begin, called it Judea and Samaria, and everyone, and I was living in Israel at that time. I said, don't worry, Schindler will never go along with this, and therefore the Carter administration won't go along with it. Well, guess what? A week later, Schindler said, look, I might have my own personal views, but I always have to stand up for the government of Israel. And he did, and ran resistance. And that really began the whole settlement process, which probably, I believe, would not have happened if the American Jews had not bought into it. So I was kind of calling him out at that point. I wrote the op-ed. I was very proud of it. Then I said, oh, God, I really don't look forward to running into him, because he probably said, like, my friend Walter slapped me in the face here. And then a few days later, sure enough, I see him at this reception, and I'm across a crowded room. One of those things where you see somebody across a crowded room and he sees you, and you start kind of gesturing with your hands, explaining. So my gesture was kind of like, I'm sorry, I was sort of apologizing for whatever hurt I made. And he walks up to me with a smile, and he comes up to me and sort of says quietly, "You don't have to apologize, Walter. You were absolutely right." So that was a great moment. So those are two. And one other one very quickly on the other side was not even the one you were talking about, but there was at the same thing in Algiers at the Palestine National Conference, a Congress, which was a very historic moment in 1988. First time the PLO edged toward support recognizing the right of Israel to exist. One of the leaders of the PLO was very hard line, who's named Khaled El Hassan, one of the founders of the PLO. He invited me to his bungalow. He's surrounded by armed guards, a big bear of a man, very scary. And he started berating me and, really, nasty. I think he was upset that the PLO was moving a little bit, in a more peaceful direction. He was against that. So he was taking it out on this Zionist. Why was he? And he was telling me that, Zionists are like Draculas who drink the blood of innocent people, a lot of, way over the top. And then fine, but I understood, listen, I can't just sit here and take this, and I have to speak up. And I said, I am a Zionist, and then that's why I'm here. I came here to see if there's a way to reconciliation between our peoples. And at that point, his manner completely changed, and he sort of said, okay, and he sat down and we had a great interview. So it was sort of like the Sharon interview. So sometimes you just that's what you really need to do is stand up for your beliefs and see what goes down.
I think real leaders who care, if you will, not to be cute, respect that, and because you're making them think rather than being yes men or yes women. And Sabeeha, I know you had stories too in the book that I read. Can you share?
Sure. So one story which is not in the book but is in real time. Yesterday, I published an op-ed in the New York Daily News, which was about the upcoming pilgrimage of the Hajj in Mecca. And I called out the Saudi government on their policy for restricting women from performing the Hajj. So they have some very rigid criteria. Essentially, it's guardianship. Unless accompanied by an approved guardian that meets the criteria or has, based on age, you need written permission from your guardian to be able to perform the Hajj. So I wrote about that and I called them out on that. Well, you should read, actually you should not read the hate mail I got on Twitter. And looking at where it was coming from, it was coming from the people in that part of the world. And it was very, very visceral.
I bet.
So much for that. And another example, when I was involved in building a mosque on Staten Island, me and my husband and many other people, somewhere along the line, I decided to get onto the board of the mosque. The chairman of the mosque supported the idea. The president of the executive board supported the idea. And then the whole sky just blew open and it blew up in our faces. Half the people on the board felt very strongly that a woman has no place on the board. And the other half felt, well, why not? And it got so difficult and the conflict was escalated. I didn't back down. Elections took place. I lost the election. Neither side was able to convince the other. And many years later, actually not even many years later, that mosque now has a woman on the board, maybe more than one. Nothing to my credit, it was just a process of evolution. Over there, the trajectory of the life of the mosque got to that point where they were able to accept a woman in leadership position. And then another incident took place not so long ago where I went with a Jewish friend of mine to a Friday sermon at a mosque close to where she lived that I had never been to before. And when I heard the imam's sermon, I was embarrassed. I was angry. I was upset. I was embarrassed because in his sermon, he made remarks that were anti-Semitic. And he challenged some of the practices of mainstream Muslims. I came home and I spoke to my husband. He wrote a letter to the imam of the mosque, who then invited us for an audience, brought us into his office. I sat down with him and said it the way I saw it. And he listened. And after he listened, he then said it the way he saw it. And by the time he finished, it was very clear that I hadn't changed his mind and he hadn't changed my mind. And we left it at that. Doesn't always work. It depends on who you're talking to and what their ideology is.
But it also shows not everybody's going to agree with you, but you don't have to hate each other at the same time.
Sure. Yeah.
You know,
Sure.
type of thing. But that it's kind of a good segue to, you know, you refer to, I can't remember who does in the book, but you refer to the sweet side and the bitter side of things, and the impact from generalizations about people, stereotyping about people, and how people are influenced, like you said, you couldn't change his mind by, and we're human, by personal experiences of terror and personal experiences of extreme hospitality, especially when it's from somebody that you don't expect to give you that extreme hospitality. It kind of reminds me, I don't know if you guys have seen the Netflix show called Fauda. It's a series, it's a show about the Israelis and Palestinians fighting, but there's also relationships with the Palestinians and Israelis. There's also romantic relationships within the Palestinian Israelis, which shows a lot of real life type of thing. And so it's against the generalizations, and I see the sweet and bitter, evolving in there. It's all there. It's not sweet and sour, it's sweet and bitter. So my question to both of you is, can the sweet and the bitter evolve to a really good taste, if you will, somehow, some way? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, we were thinking, I mean, there's so many ways to approach that question, Mark, but Sabeeha and I were thinking a little bit about sharing some of our discourse, the two of us, on the other elephant in the room, the kind of difficult passages, which I alluded to in our previous discussion. So we started talking about, a very loaded subject, which is, the Jews who were, there was a big, a lot of Jews who were in Arabia when Islam first happened, and there was a lot of painful things that happened. And one of them, at least that I had known from my experience or read about, was that there was a tribe, a Jewish tribe in Arabia called the Bani Quraysh, the sons of Quraysh. Qurayza, my fault. And to make a long story short, they had, made an alliance with Muhammad and his new movement, and then they broke the alliance and joined and fought with them in a battle together with others. Anyway, the Muslims won the battle, and there was a decision made through an arbitrator that all of the men of the Bani Qurayza should be killed, should be beheaded. And so 700 men were put to death, and the women and children were made captive. So I kind of came to the Sabeeha with that, and but it was bitter, obviously, in the sense that it wasn't like something I wanted. It was painful. It was difficult for me to do that because this wonderful woman who's writing this book with me, and I know how deeply she loves Islam, and here I am kind of saying, well, what about that? And doesn't that kind of discredit what you believe in? And so that was hard. And Sabeeha, do you want to?
So when Walter raised this question, my reaction was, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard that. But trusting him, I went to the books. I did my research. I looked for answers, explanations, emailed some scholars, called one of them on the phone. And then I got back to Walter with my long written discourse, making the case that this was a breach of a treaty. It created a national security situation. Had the opposing armies prevailed, Islam would have been wiped out forever. And at that critical point, the question was what to do with these people. And the arbiter, who was a former Jewish rabbi, invoked the Deuteronomy and said that they should be killed and the women and children taken captive. But in my research, the 700 number was being questioned. Some were saying that there were 700, some were saying no, there was no way it could be. Anyhow, so that was something that was unresolved. So when I brought that to Walter had another question. Walter, what was your question?
My question is, what would Jesus have done in that and other situations? And right. By that, I was pointing. Go ahead.
Yeah, and when he came back to me with that, I went back to the books again. I was like, okay, so yeah, I mean, that's a good question. What would Jesus have done? And I love Jesus. I love Prophet Muhammad, and I know that Jesus would say, "Turn the other cheek." But then, as I started delving into the scholarship of the scholars, what they were saying is that Jesus was a preacher. Prophet Muhammad was a preacher. He was a statesman. He was a military leader. He was a politician. He was a negotiator in foreign affairs. He was a lawmaker. He was a promulgator of the law. He was a father. He was a grandfather. He was a husband. So with all those roles that he was managing, so what if Jesus was in that role, in all those roles as well? What would Jesus have done? I don't have the answer.
And actually, when I thought about it, even having asked that question, I said, well, that Prophet Muhammad in many ways was much more of a prototype, let's say, of Moses, or who did all the same things, led the Jews out of Egypt, obviously, and fought battles, and or King David. So who was so in a sense that again shows that how Islam and Judaism in many ways are quite joined at the hip, or quite similar, because of course Moses and David and Solomon are all prophets of Islam as well. Another thing that came up in this discussion, which may sound like a small point, but it was a really fruitful one in many ways, was that I said to Sabeeha at one point, she was talking to me about how Hagar and Ishmael, were, they were cast out into the desert. And we'll talk a little bit about that more about, my thought was, Sarah, the wife of Abraham, had done that because she was jealous of Hagar, the maidservant who had given birth when she couldn't, and then she had her own son later, and all this nasty stuff, But the point is that, Sabeeha said, well, okay, well, that happened in Mecca. They were running from looking for water, and suddenly God said, there's a spring, and they saw the spring of Zamzam, which is in Mecca. And I said, well, how did that happen? How could that be in Mecca? We learned, that Abraham and his wife, that they had emigrated from Mesopotamia, come to the land of Israel, and to a place called Beersheba, which is in the northern Negev. It's also a place where I lived for 6 months when I was a new immigrant in Israel. And I myself used to go out and wander out in the desert where the Bedouin tents were, just out, a few hundred yards from the edge of town. And I used to be received in those. And so for me, that had to be in Beersheba. How could they have gotten 1,000 miles away to Mecca? And I sort of said that a little bit, maybe condescendingly, I would say. And Sabeeha responded.
Yeah. And my immediate response was, that is so integral to our faith. The location of the Kaaba which was built by Abraham and Ishmael, is all about where it was placed in Mecca. When we perform the Hajj, we run back and forth between the two hills that Hagar ran to, looking for water for her son, and that's where the spring gushed forth, and that's the spring that we drink water from when we go for the Hajj, etc., etc. But I had never questioned the location as being something that could be disputed. So of course, as Walter kept challenging me, I kept going back to the books, and I went to the primary source, which is the Quran, and it says over there very clearly about this place being in Mecca. This is where then Ishmael and Abraham built the Kaaba. But then more to Walter's point, which he said, is that how could Abraham have traveled all the way to Mecca? I mean, that is a long distance. And as I delved further into it, what I learned, and I have Walter to thank for that, is that Abraham was a traveler. We know he came from Ur to all the way to Hebron, and I actually plotted the distance from Palestine to the Hijaz in Mecca, which is 920 miles, which turned out to be 120 miles per day on a camel ride, which was not a big deal in those days. So, so here we were Google mapping how long it would have taken Abraham to ride a camel to get there. But then, Walter, you delved further into the Hagar and Ishmael issue, right? Hagar and Sarah issue.
Right. So I said to Sabeeha, look, I feel, as a Jew, when I read the Torah and the way Hagar and Ishmael are presented, well, first of all, obviously Sarah, our matriarch, and did something that was wrong, morally wrong, to cast these people out into the desert with one loaf of bread and a skin of water. I mean, how long were they going to last in the desert, right? And so I was sort of apologizing for that and saying, well, because it also felt like this was okay. Here was the conflict of Judaism and Islam going back to day one, And then what did Sabeeha say?
Yeah, so I said, Walter, that's not our narrative. We don't hold Sarah responsible for Hagar's plight. We don't believe that she compelled Abraham to force them out of the house. We don't believe that she was jealous. We believe that it was God's command. God commanded Abraham to take Sarah and Ishmael into the desert. And in fact, as the tradition goes, when he left them there in the desert and turned to go back home, she called out to him and said, "Are you leaving me here because God asked you to do that?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then he will provide for me." And so we revere Sarah. We name our daughters Sarah. When my husband and I went to Hebron to the tomb of the patriarchs, we stood over her graveside and prayed for her. So it was interesting how our conversations and our arguments kept taking us all the way back to the beginning. And we were able to then agree that we can put Sarah and Hagar's conflict to rest.
It's fascinating because, again, not to generalize, you both are pre-educated in this arena and you do research and whatnot, but the majority of people aren't. And so it's very easy to get influenced on, can you imagine if social media was around then with the camels? I mean, geez, what would have happened?
Yeah.
This
GPS, I'm getting 2 miles closer to Mecca now here.
That was one fast camel to take them 900 and something miles or whatever it was. But I find it very interesting that people are people whenever, and obviously you can bring God and faith into that, but people aren't perfect. But what's happened from, like you say, history, where most people don't have the time to do the research that you've done to find out what is the truth. And a lot of times, as you know, the conquerors write history about what happened, right or wrong, and so on and so forth. And it's even happening now with all the education we have and resources. Social media is convincing people in terrible ways, as well. So everything's changed and nothing's changed, kind of, in a way, which all gets back to, people got to be open to talking to each other like you all did. And it kind of leads me to another point, before we go to what's moving forward. And we're looking at how does economic interdependence impact people coming together too? Obviously, we work with a lot of business people, business leaders who literally care about their people and what's going on in the world, and how can they make money and do good at the same time. But like twinning, when you brought people together. There's an organization I may have mentioned in the Middle East called EcoPeace Middle East that started a number of years ago, where brought the Palestinians, the Jordanians, and Israelis together with the one purpose of bringing all people's water. Israel, one of the top in the world, still managing water, but the other, others had their resources to bring to the table too. And actually, a little story that, I don't know if I said it last time or I told you, but the Palestinian director and the Jordanian director are women, and the Israeli one happens to be a man. The Palestinian lady, Nada, her father's a Palestinian politician, and he had all sorts of threats. And you talked about mail, and he didn't have, Twitter back then, but all that about how can your daughter work with an Israeli? This is terrible, threatening him and whatnot. And then while she was telling me the story, she paused and she said, just like this, she said, "Now my father's proud of me." Because he saw that they were working together for something good. It was super touching. Just the pause was super touching for me to hear. And it's become a little bit harder now with the recent stuff, but they're still together. And now they're doing agribusiness together, tourism, and they're jumping in the Jordan River one time a year in their bathing suits, jumping into the Jordan River together, the officials, to show they're all the same, basically, and getting it going. So my point is, and Rosanna is a little bit like that too. They're all working together, right, for the well-being of those children. So I'm not asking you to give specific examples, but just your thoughts on how impactful business leaders who care can be to bring people together also, Muslims and Jews, with this whole diversity, equity, inclusion that's going on, and purposely bring them together. I'm involved with this organization called Religious Freedom and Business Foundation that talks about this, talks about employee resource groups, talks about, we do this with corporates too. So the way you've brought people together in an amazing way and tell the story, just your thoughts and opinions about how business leaders, corporate leaders, family offices can do the same thing with something like Equal Peace being an example. So I throw it out there.
Walter?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely believe you're totally right, Mark, that's a big piece of the puzzle, and obviously, business leaders can be, very impactful in ways with greater resources, obviously, than most of us. That's and I've seen pieces of that. I mean, one thing was in Detroit. It was a place that I did some work with the Muslim and Jewish communities, and as we were going along, I met a number of younger folks, young business leaders and social entrepreneurs who were very interested in working together to improve Detroit. I mean, which as has got very terrible problems. Most of these folks lived outside, lived in the suburbs, and in both cases, the Muslim communities tended to be in Dearborn, and the Jewish community a little further out. But this kind of coming together, they began really thinking about what could we do together in Detroit. And I remember they played a wonderful basketball game together. They put, and this kind of goes back to Sabeeha's stories about where's a Jew, where's a Muslim. So they mixed the teams. I mean, they didn't have Jews against Muslims. They had on both teams who were equally divided, and raised money for the inner city, for programs like cleaning up, and then there were they did some programs for improving conditions in the inner city. There was also after that efforts to coming together to clean up vacant lots and that sort of thing. And the one that was very powerful, and this was not something I can take credit for, but the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Detroit, together with the Michigan Muslim Council, actually did a health fair together, which was very, very, I think they actually more than one, where they brought Muslim and Jewish doctors together to treat people without health insurance. And I know that there was strong support from the business communities on both sides. So I'm hoping I'm staying in touch, and I'm sort of seeing that moving slowly, but I think in a very fruitful direction, where both communities have a vested interest in building a happier, a healthier Detroit, and I'm starting to see that, and I think that could be an incredibly impactful example of what we can do together.
And Sabeeha, there's a lot of women entrepreneurs out there now.
There are, and a lot is happening in the Gulf, where women are coming together and forming partnerships to work in the area of education.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say on that is, if they can actually be in business together, which is what's happening with Eco Peace, you don't have time to think about bombing your partner who's helping you make money.
Right.
If you will, and then you get to know them. Get to know them. So it's an interesting aspect. I'd love to complete with what you call the road forward. At the conclusion of the book, can you share the road forward?
So we, in our experience, have learned some lessons, and we like to share those with our viewers and our readers. In fact, that's the closing chapter of our book. We have an 8-point roadmap based on our lessons learned. And the first, which I had articulated in the last time we spoke, was that we are Americans. And while the Israeli-Palestinian conflict matters greatly, we live here, and we have so much at stake here in the United States when it comes to preserving pluralism and democracy, that we need to stick together.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, we should speak out and stay engaged whenever injustice occurs anywhere in the world, whether it is here at home or whether it's overseas. Number 3, Muslims and Jews should work together with NGOs that are doing work on the ground in Palestine and Israel that are focused on improving and saving lives of people who live over there. And Project Rosanna that Walter spoke to is an example of just that, saving lives of children.
Mm-hmm.
Number 4, allow others to speak out and speak up, even if we do not agree with them. Recognizing that Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have said things that have hurt the feelings of the Jews, they have as much right to speak up for and advocate for the Palestinians as do Jewish members of Congress like Senator Chuck Schumer and Ben Cardin to speak up for Israel. Number 5, don't allow Israel-Palestine to be weaponized. We saw that the former President Trump used this tactic in condemning Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and telling them to go back where you came from when they spoke up in support of Palestinians. And that is exactly what we don't want happening. Number 6, let's not denigrate or demonize people on either side. Activists like Linda Sarsour correctly demand that they be allowed to speak out as proud Palestinian Americans, but we do not agree when Zionists are demonized.
Right.
Number 7, Muslims should engage with mainstream American Jews who consider themselves Zionists rather than allying themselves exclusively with anti-Zionist groups. And the same for the Jewish groups. They need to engage with people like Tlaib Omar, even if they do not agree with them on the Israeli-Palestinian issues, but do agree with them on causes that are important to all of them, both sides, causes important for America. And then finally, number 8, let's be cautious about labeling one another as anti-Semitic or Islamophobic. When anybody criticizes Israel's leaders or their policies, it is just that, a criticism of the leaders and their policies. It is not a criticism of all Jews. And similarly, criticism of Muslim leaders and their policies in Muslim countries is not Islamophobia. Yet we need to be sensitive to the sensibilities on each side so that our comments are not construed as being either Islamophobic or anti-Semitic, particularly if they were not meant to be as such. And it's all there. We refuse to be enemies. How Muslims and Jews can make peace, one friendship at a time. So please.
I can vouch that it's all there because now I've read it all. So, Walter?
Well, yeah, I mean, the reason that these 8 points are very important is because they really, I think, give us a roadmap as to how not to get the relationship building sidetracked, by the Israeli-Palestinian issue and other ancillary issues. And again, we feel so happy and really great about how far we've come from nothing in 15 years ago, but we still have so far to go, and it will not be easy. But this relationship between our two communities, the two largest minority faith communities in America, is so vital for the health and well-being of our respective communities and of America. So we really are, we just got to keep doing it. We got to keep building it more and more and more. And I think we're, a few, I don't know, an eighth of the way up the mountain, but who thought we'd get this far? And I think we can go all the way. And hopefully, as Martin Luther King says, we'll live to get up there and look over the beautiful landscape of peace and togetherness.
Yeah, we have to keep hope, and you've said it a bunch of times. Active listening is so important. And if we all had the same ideas and all the same everything, how boring would that be? and what new innovations and new things would not happen because we're all the same.
By the way, Mark, did you know that that very thought is in the Quran? Maybe Sabeeha can share it's one of the most wonderful quotations, I think, in the Quran.
I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have it handy with me,
Ah,
but it does talk about,
right.
the
Well, if God had
humanity.
wanted, if God had wanted us all to be
Yeah.
the same, he could have created us all the same, but he chose,
Yeah,
but he chose to.
let me see if I can remember it. I have created you into tribes and nations
Right.
so that you may get to know one another.
Right, right,
And just speaking to the diversity, God made us that way.
right.
He made us different so that we could value each other's differences.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's beautiful, and that's the whole ball game. So I'm not going to say anything else because that's, I think, concludes it fantastically. So thanks for reading the book. Thanks for sharing it with me. Thanks for sharing with the audience, and thanks for doing what you've done and what you continue to do. Toda rabba and salam, shalom. And,
thank you. Thank you. Thank you for reading the book, and thank you for the forum.
Absolutely, Mark. We're so grateful. This has just been a wonderful opportunity for us to flesh it out and share it, hopefully, with many people through you.
More to come, right?